Hello, thank you for joining me. I externalize my studies of a book a week by sharing the passages that are most prominent to me and my thoughts about the focus topics covered in the books. This is my final day reading from Alan Watts' The Supreme Identity. The essence of realization or enlightenment is in complete acceptance of the patterning of circumstances and heredity that sums up into the unique expression of each of our human forms. In remembering that the original source of our energy is inside each of us, actively energizing us, we may refrain from grasping for it, and in so doing pushing it away, as the very grasping for it implies that it is outside and adrift, an object to be sought after. We may open the option of accepting the totality of our experience, including, rather than in spite of, the elements that we've been conditioned to label as negative and to resist. And in so doing, join the present moment. Surrender to the flow of the eternal stream. Without further ado, I'll move toward today's readings. Enjoy.
Page 142. From the successive standpoint of time, the drama of creation and redemption, of the infinite manifesting itself in the finite, may be divided into two stages. The first is involution, wherein the Supreme Self deliberately forgets and lays aside its omniscience, and identifies itself with finite points of view, culminating in the experience of total separateness and independence as the human ego. The second is evolution, wherein the self awakens to its true identity within the finite order, not forsaking it as a prison, but using it as an instrument of expression. Page 150. At the moment when the ego surrenders and gives up the battle, finding that the attempt to make itself like God is bound to fail, the self awakens to its own independence. In surrender, the ego thoroughly accepts and admits its own finitude. But who accepts? Who knows the finitude of the ego? In reality, the self has at last given up its identification with the ego, perceiving the ego as a finite object quite distinct from its own proper being. And in that instant, the self knows its own eternity and infinity, realizing that from the beginning the entire drama has had no more effect upon its essential nature than the ripples in a pool upon the sun, whose reflected image they break and scatter. Page 153. From the eternal standpoint, every life, every individual, in whatever stage he may have lived and died, has manifested an essential and integral part of the total finite harmony. Every point on the circle is equally close to the center. Tragic as it may seem from the level of time and succession to die, when no further than the darkest and most trying phases of ego consciousness, the life so lived has not been in vain. For in eternity, those phases are no absolute evil. They are as much of the essence of the total harmony as the burial of the seed is of the essence of the total growth of a plant. Page 171. Whether one tries to do something or to do nothing about realization, in either instance, one is overlooking the truth that both action and inaction involve the error of supposing that realization is something to be attained in the future. But since the content of realization is eternal, it must in some sense be present at this moment. Thus, to wait for it denies its presence just as much as seeking for it actively. Page 177. The self distinguishes itself from the finite experience not by rejecting it, but by accepting it, by letting it be free to be as it is. For the infinite is not to be set over against the finite as something existing apart from it, and realization does not therefore consist in isolating the self from the ego and the contents of consciousness. As we have seen, the nature of the self and of the infinite is precisely not to be standoffish, to separate itself from the finite. Page 181. Invariably, an external action which, from the moral standpoint, is sin, is the result of not accepting some prior state of the soul, whether of insecurity, boredom, frustration, or anger. The external sin is an attempt to escape from an internal limitation, and if the internal limitations are thoroughly accepted, the external escape will not be required. Page 187. Transcendence is not separation, and similarly, from the metaphysical standpoint, holiness is not set apartness, but the wholeness of that which is all-inclusive. It is thus, then, that realization comes through a conscious and deliberate plunging into life, not in retreat from it, through a generous acceptance of finite experience, not in blotting it out of mind, through utter willingness to be what one is, not in trying to lift oneself to heaven by one's own bootstraps. The self realizes freedom from the finite world by deliberate self-abandonment to its limitations. Page 188. In short, when expressed in language, the way of realization is pure paradox. Willingness to be insecure is the ultimate security. Willingness to suffer is the essence of divine joy. Willingness to be finite is to know one's own infinity. On page 193, this will be the final passage that I'll read from this book. Our trouble is that the egotistic viewpoint is so thoroughly complex that it has extreme difficulty in recognizing the essentially simple. The entire point of the Zen method is therefore to draw attention to the absolute self-evidence of the ultimate reality. For though it is nearer than breathing and closer than hands and feet, we expend untold effort in seeking it as something wholly obscure and remote. Nothing is therefore of more importance in the work of realization than to remember that what you desire to know is simple rather than complex, present rather than absent, obvious rather than hidden.